Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Hope you're well. My name's Alex, and this is Slumber Time Podcast. Today we have ourselves another political discussion, and again, this time we will be looking at some more of the empirical data and logic to back up many of the claims. As a former debater, I ask that you use statistics to back up any contentions in any type of debate that you have, like I will try to be doing today. I also ask that if you give a rebuttal to avoid any fallacies, I'll do my best to follow that as well in this podcast, and I ask that anybody who debates any political topics to do the same. If you see any logical fallacies, they should be made clear, and I mean this for the comment section here and for outside discussions. I know that you will unlikely be able to change the person's mind, but my goal is to stop the spreading of misinformation and to have a structured discussion without any personal attacks. This podcast is purely educational, and I will just let the facts speak for themselves. So the election season is upon us, and in the United States we are seeing dozens of commercials a day about who to vote for. Once the votes are tallied after November 3rd and before December 14th this year, the one with the most amount of electoral votes gets represented by some electors to represent those votes in what is called the Electoral College. Each state is given a certain number of votes for the president, generally based on the number of people that state has in the House of Representatives. The winner needs 270 votes or more to win. The big debate is whether to keep the Electoral College or not. If not, it would then likely go to the popular vote, which would allow for every vote to count the same. In the Electoral College, the smaller states receive more power in order to balance out the larger states. Basically, the existence of the Electoral College allows for somebody to win without actually needing to win more than 50% of the votes, like in 9% of the past US elections. Now, if you're in the US, you're already familiar with most of that. There's a very lengthy history in how this came to be, and there have been several court cases in regards to this and changing the Constitution. The way electors are chosen is also very complex, and there are many alternatives to that as well. I'll be discussing those points a little, but today I thought I would make this similar to a public forum case. The resolution I found on the National Forensics League speech and debate website states, resolved, direct popular vote should replace electoral college vote in the U.S. presidential elections. For me, I affirm the resolution, and my contentions are 1. It makes every vote equal, creating a pure democracy. 2. The Electoral College is in itself contradictory. And 3. Most Americans want to change as of 2020. Those are a couple of examples, and there are, of course, responses to the negative, but I'll be getting into those a little bit later. So for the first contention, we are able to make every vote equal. Now, in order to avoid the fallacy of the appeal to tradition, it will not matter what the original Constitution says because we are discussing whether to change it. You can't just say it's tradition and should stay. That's not a real reason. So why did the Founding Fathers set it up that way? Alexander Hamilton said in the Federalist Paper number 68, the process of the Electoral College affords a moral certainty that the office of president will never fall to the lot of any man who is not in eminent degree endowed with the requisite qualifications. Basically, it was to prevent uneducated people from choosing the president. That's why we vote for the electors to choose the president. Then they use their votes the month after the election to finally make the official vote for the president, which this year will be December 14th. The reason for this is that if someone wins one state, that shouldn't be enough, and it was up to the electors to choose who would be best suited to become president. To put this into perspective, Hamilton wrote this in 1788 when there were 13 states and only 10 of them counted in what was the very first U.S. election. It would then make sense that the candidate would need the support of the majority of the states if they wanted to become president. The issue is that the education or the qualification of the electors is irrelevant these days. Just this year, the Supreme Court announced in the case Chiafolo versus Washington, today we consider whether a state may also penalize an elector for breaking his pledge and voting for someone other than the presidential candidate who won his state's popular vote. We hold that a state may do so. The Constitution's text and the nation's history both support allowing a state to enforce an elector's pledge to support his party's nominee and the state's voter's choice for president. This means that the electors must do what the vote tells them to do. they are no longer considered a line of defense when it comes to the presidential election. The case there mentions popular vote, and one reason that we should move to it, as stated by Dale R. Duran, adjunct professor of mathematics at the University of Washington. He said in his article, "Whose vote counts the least in the Electoral College?" that Wyoming has 3 electoral votes in a population of 586,107, while California has 55 electoral votes and 39,144,818 residents. Distributing the electoral vote evenly among each state's residents suggests that individual votes from Wyoming carry 3.6 times more influence or weight than those from California. If you look at the numbers further, a vote in Florida is only worth 78% of a vote. So one person there has less power in the outcome of the election than in any other state. Wyoming has a ratio of 3 to 1, meaning their vote is worth 3 votes. Your vote will have more power or less power depending on where you live. Now, the main reason people cite is that it is meant to balance the power between big and small states. The common rhetoric states that the larger states will overpower the smaller ones under the popular vote, so we must give more power to the small ones. The same goes for the cities. The interesting thing is, the actual data shows a different story. Let's look at the cities first. They, of course, decide based on the popular vote. The 20 largest cities make up 11% of the population, and the 50 biggest cities in the country represent about 15% of the population. Even in fairly big cities with more than 350,000 people or so, roughly 40% of the vote goes to Republican candidates, and in any case it's far from zero. And then by comparison, the rural areas of America also represent about 15% of the population, and they vote about 60-40 in favor of the Republicans. So big cities in rural America are essentially awash in every presidential election. So the idea that big cities would somehow suddenly decide who the president was for everybody else is just wrong on the math, says Jesse Wegman from the New York Times in an interview with Vox. That's why so many people point at Los Angeles, San Francisco, San Jose, and Oakland and say they don't have the ability to sway the election. That's why they've had Republican governors like Arnold Schwarzenegger or Ronald Reagan. Literally since Reagan, half of them have been Republicans and half have been Democrats. New York has had 3 out of 8 be Republicans since Reagan started being governor in 1967, and Illinois has had 5 out of 11 be Republicans since Reagan. The argument just does not hold up. Let's look at the states now. George C. Edwards III uses the data from statistics of the presidential and congressional election for the last 5 elections, and I will be sharing that here. When you now look at the largest 11 states and popular vote of the last 5 elections, there was only one election in which the popular vote winner in the big states won the entire election. Every other time, the larger states voted for the loser in regards to the popular vote. For example, in 2016, 42% of voters in the 11 largest states voted for Trump and 49% for Clinton. However, Trump won 7 of the 11 largest states, giving him 152 electoral votes, while Clinton got 118. At the very least, the data is showing us the larger states would have little to no effect on the overall outcome of the election under the popular vote. Also, of the 11 largest states in the last 5 elections, the largest percentage of the vote was 62%. That was California, but every other state was within 12 points. If the popular vote were counted, there would still be 38% of the votes going towards the other candidate instead of the all or nothing we have right now. And that's just considering the largest difference. The mean is actually 55%. So what the rhetoric doesn't take into account is that the votes are not going to be 100% to just one candidate, unlike in the Electoral College system. This brings me to my next contention. The Electoral College is in itself contradictory. The Electoral College was made so that the candidates would have to focus on every state and not just a few. However, it is already well known we have swing states, meaning that the candidates now only have to look at a few. For the 2020 election, statistically, they only have to look at 4 states: Florida, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Those 4 states comprise 86% of the current true toss-up, even though they have just 15% of the population. Another key point is The Electoral College was made in order to avoid the tyranny of the majority. They did not want just one party winning all the time, for example, and they especially wanted to look out for the minority votes as well. The contradiction comes into play when you consider that all of the votes within one state, except for Nebraska and Maine, will go to just one person. All it takes is for 50% plus one vote to take the whole state and win all of the votes for that state. If that isn't majority rule, I don't know what is. You're taking the voice away from the minority in that state completely. What's more is that it is mathematically possible to only need between 16 to 22% of the popular vote to win enough electoral votes to win the entire election. The chances are low, but it is absolutely possible. We've seen a tie in the Electoral College before, so nothing is off the table. For a system to be in place where it is possible for 1 in 5 people to be part of the party that rule over the other 4, you are literally describing the demographics of the apartheid in South Africa. Any system where the majority is ruled over by the minority is also not fair or just, and creating that so-called tyranny of the minority. Speaking of apartheid as well, even one of the key foundations of the Electoral College is slavery. James Madison said, "There was one difficulty, however, of a serious nature attending an immediate choice by the people. The right of suffrage was more diffusive in the northern than the southern states, and the latter could have no influence in the election on the score of the Negroes." To use the words of Jacob Windling, slave-owning states wanted political representation that was proportional to their population, but they didn't want most of their population to have political representation. That's the genesis of things like the Three-Fifths Compromise. Any rudimentary study of the time when our Constitution was being written reveals that slavery was at the heart of every dispute in this new government as far as appropriating political power goes. And you'll never guess what Madison said the solution was to fusing a practical union between this difficulty in presidential elections. James Madison continued, "The substitution of electors obviated this difficulty and seemed on the whole to be liable to fewest objections." Like many of the institutions at the time, slavery was central to the Electoral College as well. Now, the third contention is this. The majority of American people want to get rid of it. Obviously, you would need 66% of the vote to make an amendment in the Constitution, and only 63% of Americans want to get rid of it. Even if the representatives of the American people voted the way Americans actually felt, they would still come up short. However, every other vote in the United States is based on the popular vote, and the foundation on which the Electoral College was built is barely even recognizable as when it was established. 63% is still a majority and seemingly bipartisan, so change can be done in a different way. The option that every state has is to agree to put all of their electoral votes toward the popular vote winner. You might be wondering, how does that work? There's an agreement called the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, which is an agreement that is between the states that they would put all of their electoral votes toward the popular vote winner. All you would need is 270 electoral votes, and they currently have 196 right now. The other 74 will be hard to get, but it is certainly possible. That way, you still keep the electoral votes, which is in the Constitution, but you give them to the popular vote winner instead. You even have the current President of the United States, Donald Trump, a man who I agree with politically on only 4% of all topics, say that the Electoral College is a disaster for democracy back in 2012. Now, for those who do think that this is a partisan issue, all I really have to say is, if any of the wins Republicans got from losing the popular vote happened for the Democrats, you would see so many Republicans furious with the system too, and Democrats would be saying, "I know, right?" And so, because it can affect both sides equally, I do not believe this is a partisan matter. All right, now that's it for today. What do you think? Were there any arguments that I made that didn't make as much sense? Are there any areas that I'm missing? Was there something I said that just is completely wrong? Please back it up with evidence if you do have something to say. Otherwise, just remember we're here and we're listening.